have people in ready to go. Awesome. Hey everyone, I'm Rick Mikesell. I am the Chief Operations Manager of Trouts Fly Fishing, mostly at the Denver store. As some of you may know, or some of you don't, I'm pretty passionate about fishing the Denver South Platte. I'm a Denver native, went to school at Metropolitan State College here in Denver, and right as I was going to college, I was kind of getting back into fishing from doing it as a child, and Metro State College is backed up by the Denver South Platte. I'd have some time between classes to go fishing and started exploring the river. And not knowing anything about the South Platte and kind of hearing things anecdotally that it was dirty or unsafe or unclean or a mess, I was really surprised when I first started fishing it just to see how good of a resource it was. And we'll talk about it as length as we go through here, but the river is getting better by the month, week, year. There's a lot of very interested parties who are contributing greatly to making huge strides on making the river a cool place to recreate from a boating standpoint, from a hiking standpoint, and most importantly, from a fishing standpoint. So I've seen it get better every year for the past 17, 18 years, and it's only going to continue to do so. Fish species are thriving, fish are getting healthier, access is getting better, there's stream improvements being made every day. So it's really exciting to see how cool this resource right in our backyard is going to be, and more importantly, how good it is right now. For those that don't know, we are currently in the process of opening a new location right off Zuni and 8th Avenue, and it's literally going to back up to the Denver South Platte. The Denver South Platte has always kind of been my home water, and we've always had a lot of involvement in it as a shop. But literally, in a handful of months, when we're finally able to open our new location, it'll be our home water. Literally, we'll be able to walk out the back door and potentially fish it. So I wanted to share with everyone as much as I possibly can about how to fish this river. It has some unique challenges, and there's some very different things that you have to think about when approaching it, especially if you're used to a very traditional front range trout fishing mentality. But we can go through all of that and get you fishing and really enjoying this special place. With the unique situation that we're in right now, potentially traveling 2, 3 hours to different communities isn't the greatest thing to do. So if you need to get out and fish and you need to stay away from people, there's almost 30 miles of public access through the Denver metro area, and definitely be considerate of other people. And this river's seeing more pressure now than it has in probably the last 15 to 20 years. But it's a cool fishery and there's lots of it to fish. So if you take your time and explore it and put in the time and have fun with it and respect other people, it's a great time to be on the river. We'll go to the first slide here now, and I'll give you a little bit of history on the Denver South Platte River. And there is a little bit of a delay here, so just be patient with us. I'll get the hang of having the delay and not leave you with too much gap in between slides. If you have questions while I'm going through this, definitely type them in the chat box. I'll do my best to answer all of them as thoroughly as possible. And if it's something that'll be answered in a future slide or a future talking point, I'll just let you know and just stay put. I'm happy to answer any questions I can. So the Denver South Platte was critical in the foundation of Denver. The reason that we are here now is because of the Denver South Platte. Native American peoples had camped on its banks, getting food and water, fish to eat, water to wash and clean and drink for hundreds and hundreds of years prior to Western settlement. When the first settlers came here, two of the first settlements, the town of Denver and the town of Auraria, actually kind of competed against each other on the opposite sides of the banks of the confluence of Cherry Creek and the Denver South Platte, right where we know REI and Confluence Park is now. The American humorist Artemus Ward once described the river as a mile wide and an inch deep. And if you go out north on I-76 and look at the structure of the river out there, it's still very much the same. It's very wide and very shallow. Traditional species in the river were pike minnow to some degree, and then lots of small minnow species like dace and plain starters and things like that. The river we know in the Denver metro area was created in 1965 by the historic flood. With the immense rain that they got in a short period of time, the river spiked at 40,000 CFS. At that time, historical flows were about 800 CFS. Current flows on the river are just under 200 CFS, if that's any gauge. It was a giant wall of water. And if you visit the Carson Nature Center in the town of Littleton, there's a lot of really great photos that show this flood. It was insane how devastating it was. The municipalities of Littleton and Denver and all the other municipalities decided at that point that a flood like this could never happen again. So they created the Chatfield Dam and they channelized the river through most of the urban corridor, just so if there was a flood instance, it would travel very quickly and not cause any damage. So Chatfield, at least for right now, is not necessarily a water storage reservoir, it's a flood control reservoir. And if you traverse the river anywhere that hasn't had major stream improvements, it's a giant trapezoid, a flat bottom with two big riprap walls that come up on either side. And that's for the sole purpose of shooting water through the metro area out to the eastern plains and causing as little damage as possible. Long forgotten and pollution ridden, we've made a lot of progress in the last 20 years to make this river clean and healthy and safe and a great place to fish. Lots of bodies from both governmental agencies and concerned parties like the Greenway Foundation, Denver Trout Unlimited. We've all worked really, really hard to improve water quality, to improve stream structure, to improve fish stocks. There's been a lot of hands in the river, and there's a lot of parties that really want to see it get better. And we'll talk a lot about this as we go through each section as to what's been done and what's going to be done. But it's amazing how much the river has changed in the last 20 years. Native species in the river, like I noted, included the pike minnow. We may know those from the western slope. They're an endangered species that we're working hard to recover there. Unfortunately, western settlers wiped them out from pollution and electrofishing and overfishing. They pretty much decimated the river of any food stocks or fish stocks. As such, in 1879, 476 common carp were stocked in the river. At the time, carp were the top-notch aquaculture species. People loved to eat them. People loved to fish for them. They were the belle of the ball for fisheries management in the 1800s or the late 1800s. And as such, they stocked 476 of them in the Denver South Platte River. And the carp that we still catch today are descendants of that original stock. Keep in mind that that's about the same time that they were stocking brown trout and rainbow trout in our rivers in the high country. People that argue that carp are an invasive species, quite frankly, they were put in this river for the same purpose and at the same time as rainbow and brown trout. So you have to kind of consider that they're just as reasonable to be here as rainbows and browns that we love to fish for. So keep that in mind. In the late 1980s and the early 1990s, two of my personal heroes, Barry Reynolds and Brad Beefus, started to pioneer carp on the fly. Folks didn't necessarily think that you could catch carp with a fly or they were worth catching with a fly. And quite frankly, Barry and Brad proved that not only can you catch them, but they're unbelievably challenging and super fun. And we'll go over carp in depth here later. Of course, I'm going to talk a lot about carp. But they really pioneered that carp on the fly as a sport fish, and things have really skyrocketed since then. So we always have to say thank you to Barry and Brad for kind of bringing us all to that realization. In the early 21st century, kind of about the time I started flirting with the river, lots of other species became present at target as well, and they were always kind of there. But stream improvements and water quality improvements and just recognition of the river as a fishery really brought them to the forefront. And we'll go through in depth in later slides all the species you can target in the river on a regular basis. There's, of course, some weird stuff that pops up every now and again. But it's a multi-species fishery and a really good multi-species fishery. We'll talk greatly about smallmouth bass, too. And smallmouth bass really is what's going to make this river shine. As I've talked about already, and I'll talk about a ton more, major stream improvements have been made in the last decade under the direction of Greenway and Denver Trout Unlimited, Colorado Parks and Wildlife, lots of invested community partners. And in the next 10 years, we're going to see that stream improvement or that stream restoration extend potentially all the way from the Chatfield Dam to National Western Stock Show. The Denver Urban Waterways Project, and then a bunch of other smaller projects in between, will largely address the entirety of the river. That's almost 20 miles of river, and create low flow channels, create riparian benches for recreation and, of course, flood control and aquatic vegetation, address temperature issues, address flow issues. It's going to do a ton to keep that place a meaningful fishery, a great place to recreate, a safe place to recreate. It's really exciting. In 10 years, this place is going to be amazing. The other big achievement that we do already have under our belt is the Chatfield Reallocation Project. And as many of you know, Chatfield Dam is going to be expanded, or the capacity of Chatfield is going to be expanded in the coming years. And a lot of involved partners, Greenway, Denver Trout Unlimited, Trouts raised a ton of money through our Throwback Film Fests to garner acre feet for this. We're going to get an environmental pool. And that environmental pool is going to collect water during high flows. And as a party that's involved, we can request CPW, who is the managing partner, to release water in low flow or zero flow days. On average right now, we have upwards of 100 zero flow days out of Chatfield, and that's the primary source of water through the river. If we can negate those zero flow days and get some water coming out of the dam, especially being that that upper stretch is a bottom release tailwater, we can support so many more fish species and, more importantly, macroinvertebrates that the fish species eat with abundant, clear, cool, oxygenated water. So that's going to start next year potentially, as soon as we have the management process all ironed out, and we should see almost no zero flow days out of Chatfield Reservoir thanks to this effort. So huge feather in the cap of all the parties involved, and really excited to see the positive changes that come with that. So we're going to go to the next slide here. So I have here a map of the urban South Platte. This reflects Chatfield Dam to the Clear Creek confluence at about I-270. If anyone would like a copy of this, we have it in our current magazine. You can either send us a note, orders at troutsflyfishing.com, shop at troutsflyfishing.com, Rick at troutsflyfishing.com, and we're glad to mail you out a physical copy. Or if you just go to our website, there's a digital copy that you can access and print out. I went through this pretty diligently to give you the best access points. And the reason for just putting access points is we'll go into more depth about how to fish this fishery, but it's not a traditional fishery like Deckers or Cheeseman or the Blue where there's holes or defined best spots. There's lots of fluctuation, lots of changes. Fish are moving constantly. So really what you're looking for is places that you can safely access the river. Once you do access the river, there's a bike path through the entirety of the stretch pictured, so you can get to every point in the river in this stretch and park safely. We're in an urban area, so if you park illegally or park in a funky spot, you get towed or ticketed or have issues like that. So all of these stars are really safe places to park your car. And the good news, bad news for some folks is you got to walk. So you'll work these stretches, you'll walk big chunks of it, you'll find holding water, or if you're doing the really fun stuff like carp fishing, you're actively walking around looking for fish to sight fish to. So if you need a copy of this map, jump on our website, reach out to us, we'll get it to you. But these are all safe access points through the urban corridor, and then you can access the entirety of the river in the stretch through the bike path. So we'll go to the next slide here and start breaking down the river into sections. So the first section that we are going to talk about is Chatfield Dam to Union Avenue. This is the true tailwater section. So this has the most impact from Chatfield Reservoir. Species that we can find in this stretch are brown and rainbow trout, walleye, smallmouth bass, channel catfish, and to some degree carp. And if I'm chattering a little bit, I apologize. I'm in my basement and I turned the furnace off so it wouldn't be noisy in the background. And it just got really cold down here. So don't mean to be chattering. Um, this stretch, fishing is highly dictated by flows released from the reservoir. And as we noted, we're working really hard to get zero flow days completely removed. But in the wintertime, when there's no water calls or we're not trying to push water through the system, there can be zero flow days. So fishing can be negatively impacted. The other reality is there was a major stream improvement effort over the past year through the state park and down through the Chatfield Park ponds, almost to the Carson Nature Center. So there's still a little bit of construction remnants, and a large chunk of this was closed down for a while. It's now open throughout the state park, but there may be some issues with access if there are machines or people doing mitigation in this stretch. One of my favorite things to do in this stretch is fish for walleye. Walleye come out of the bottom of Chatfield Dam. In the old days, they actually used to time the flow increase with the walleye spawn, and huge quantities of gigantic walleye used to get rocketed out the bottom of the dam. And it used to be kind of a cool nighttime community of walleye fishermen down there catching really high quality walleye at night. They've gotten wise and realized that that's not the best idea to send all their walleye stocks out the bottom of the river. So now they've changed the timing, but there still is a meaningful walleye population in this stretch. My favorite flows to target walleye, this is mostly in the state park, is about 100 to 300 CFS. So if I see flows in that 200, 300 range, I really like to go out, especially in low light at night. And we'll talk more about tactics later with sink tip and bait fish and catch some walleye. Below C470 to Bulls Avenue is another really popular trout stretch on the river. There is occasional stocking of catchables in this, and there is a pretty fair rate of holdover, just given that water temps coming out of the dam could support trout stocks. So lots of trout in there potentially. With the low flows on the construction, it hasn't been a huge trout destination recently, but now that we're getting back into releases, and I'm assuming some stocking will be coming shortly, we will see some trout fishing start to get good in that stretch. And I'm just going to check real quick and see if I'm caught up on any questions or comments. Absolutely, Chris. There's tons of great smallmouth in here as well. And we'll talk about smallmouth throughout this presentation. But smallmouth are really the bright spot in this river. It has the potential in the next 10 years to become an unbelievable smallmouth fishery. Most of the improvements that we've seen as far as stream restoration have taken place on this stretch. From the dam through the C470 construction and down into the Carson Nature Center and some of the stuff by the Breck Brewery, we've seen a ton of really good stream restoration, and it's a cool model for stream restoration that's going to be adopted further down the river as they progress. It's essentially going to be a low flow channel with riparian benches up to the high water mark. So that creates kind of a small channel. So when there's very little flow, there's oxygenation and cold water moving through it. And as water increases, it benches up continuously. So we have a way to funnel potential high water or flood water through the metro, but we have vegetation and erosion control and oxygenation. The big issue with this river is because it's a flood control plateau, we can't just drop rocks and boulders or dams or things like that in it, because if it does flood, we get a 500-year flood, all of that's going to be washed downstream and create destruction. So we have to create structure that can't be washed away. And with this sinuous riparian bench structure, we can create riffle runs, we can create drops, we can create different flow channels without dropping stuff in the middle of the river like you see it maybe Arkansas below Pueblo, like those big V weir dams. We can't do this in this river because it's flood control. So engineers and water managers are getting super creative to give us a cool fishery without creating any public safety concerns. The other really cool thing about Stretcher River, and quite frankly the river in its entirety, is it's healthy. Denver Metro Water Control has worked really hard to keep the water crazy clean. The water may be a little trashy, but as far as pollution or dissolved metals, it's unbelievably healthy, and as such, the bug life is crazy. I see Baetis, caddis, trichos. I've even seen like they look almost like a calabatus, big mayflies. There's stoneflies that we found in Stretch, not in great abundance, but they're there. Crayfish population is huge. The cranefly larva population is huge. The bugs in this river are super healthy, and the fish have lots to eat. The other good news is there's lots of bigger prey in here. There's lots of shiner minnows and carp fry and smallmouth bass fry and tons of crayfish. So there's lots of food for fish to eat. And as such, most specimens of fish that we find in the river are crazy healthy. I mean, I've had breathe through your teeth Baetis hatches while carp fishing. Of course, carp aren't going to waste their time to come up and eat a small Baetis, but they're there. And as we see smallmouth bass populations and trout populations expand, we're really going to see them take advantage of all these bugs and get really healthy. So we'll go down to the next stretch. And Brandon, thanks for your question there. I actually have this on an issue, so a digital version of this PowerPoint that Yvonne can share with you. By the way, let's give a big thanks to Yvonne Orsic, who's doing all this, running all the slides, doing all the filming, putting this all out for you. He's doing an awesome job of making sure that everybody has some cool stuff to learn and watch while we're all kind of stuck in our basements or houses. So big thanks to Yvonne, but he'll share this with you after we're done here. We'll put a link in so you can read through the PowerPoint. So the next stretch we're going to talk about is Union to Alameda. And this is kind of the most multi-species stretch, one of the more diverse stretches. It's also stretches for size and quality of fish. It's also my favorite stretch to target smallmouth. I found the biggest smallmouth here and the biggest population of smallmouth. So really good smallie fishing, great carp fishing. There's still some walleye. There's channel catfish present throughout. And we're a little far from the two trout drop points, but there still could potentially be trout through here. So that's an option. Once we get this far down below Union, we do start to see major seasonal temp variance since we have lost the cold water of the tailwater. So trout are generally most active in colder months, so October through March. They tend to go to deeper holes and move upstream when it gets warmer. There are potentials in the summertime for water temps in this stretch to be above 75, potentially even to 80. So as we know, unless a trout is hunkered down and maximizing energy, those temps are fatal. So not a huge trout stretch, but they're definitely there. The ones that we catch in this stretch and in pretty much every stretch below are usually super healthy. Part of that is some of them are stocked as broods, so they do get big. But a lot of that is there's lots of food and not a lot of competition from other trout. So 16 to 22 is common. I've seen fish 25 to 27, and they're all fat and mostly full of crayfish. So the quality of fish in this river is world class. Union to Oxford is home to some of the larger carp and smallmouth. The River Run Park restoration was primarily done for whitewater recreation, and as such, it's made it less of a carp hotspot than it was in the past. Those fish are still there. It's just not the traditional flat system that we are used to, so you got to work a little harder to find the big carp in the Union to Oxford stretch, but they're definitely still there. There's some big smallmouth in there. I mean, I've seen fish that are 4 to potentially even 5 pounds, 18, 19-inch smallmouth. I mean, really high-quality smallmouth. And the population is increasing every year. They're self-sustaining. They've gotten in through release from Chatfield and then some interconnected ponds throughout. They're naturally reproducing. Trout will likely never naturally reproduce in this river. Trout don't even actually reproduce in Deckers and Cheeseman. It's a long shot that they'll have it. Brown trout do, of course. Rainbows not so much. There may be, if we get some major stuff done, brown trout can reproduce in the upper stretches of this. Smallmouth are reproducing already. Carp are reproducing already. Walleye are reproducing already. I don't see any documentation of it, but potentially catfish are reproducing already. So these fish are self-sustaining. They don't require stocking, and the stocks are growing every year, so it's only going to get better. Um, this stretch does see a lot of pressure, so fish are a little bit spookier than they are on some other stretches. So keep that in mind. Since they've done the stream restoration at River Run, it definitely doesn't get hit as much as it used to, but it was kind of a hot spot for a while. So you got to bring your A game for the carp and for the smallies. Near Bear Creek, if you don't know, is a brown trout fishery through Metro Denver. Below Bear Creek Reservoir, there is a small but healthy population of brown trout throughout, and as such, the brown trout have entered the South Platte. And I've seen very few, but some really high quality brown trout species specimens in there. If you ever want to go explore Bear Creek, you're not going to see a ton of fish, but there's some nice fish throughout there. So here in town, there's some cool trout opportunities. We're actually working as a chapter in Denver Trout Unlimited to get some dam structures removed, so there's even better connection between Bear Creek and the Denver South Platte. So that fishery as a brown trout fishery could potentially get better. Like I said earlier, the Mary Carter Greenway Trail at this stretch, but there's a bike trail of some regards throughout. So you have access to almost every inch of river throughout the urban corridor. You can jump on your bike, you can walk, you can skateboard. I don't think you're supposed to ride those little scooters around, so maybe don't do that. But there is private property on maybe one side or in small corners, but the actual river bottom itself, you can access through its entirety. So this gives you tons of public access, lots of room to move. And most of these fish species are moving around constantly to find food. So if you see somebody in a hole you saw on Instagram, likely is those fish maybe aren't even in that hole anymore and they're in the wrong spot. So you're going to find fish no matter what. You just constantly have be moving, looking for, in the case of smallmouth or walleye or catfish, the proper structure or the proper lies, and in the case of carp, looking for actual carp. This is a sight fishery, and we'll talk about it a ton in the carp section. But if you're willing to go out and learn how to sight fish for carp, you're going to have the best success, and by leaps and bounds, the most fun doing it. Overland Park's another great place to access at this stretch. Ton of stream improvements there as well. Ronnie Crawford, one of the kind of grandfathers of the river through Denver Trout Unlimited, actually stood down there and gave over-the-shoulder directions to the construction crews as to how to best lay out the stream improvements. So he made sure that the fish were considered in those stream improvements. Great smallmouth access point. Overland Park Pond actually has carp and some smallmouth bass in it and is stocked with trout for you to go catch at times of the year. So good little spot to go try your hand at smallmouth fishing, carp fishing, potentially catfishing, and sometimes trout. So it's a great diverse stretch, lots of access, lots of park access. And because it kind of benefits from both modern stream restoration and some of the old urban stream structure, you get a little bit of best of both worlds. There is some cool stuff that happens when you have bridge pilings and shopping carts and old tires and big piles of riprap. You get some cool lies and some cool holding structure that fish do translate to. So even though the river is going to improve as we see those go away, it's still a cool way to fish. So you get a little bit of both in this stretch. So keep that in mind. And the biggest thing to do if you're looking for fish in any of these stretches of the river for smallmouth, trout, and walleye is to find the right structure. And we'll go over that again in depth later on here. But if you're looking for carp, you got to find flats, and there's lots of good flats in this stretch. So jump on your bike, ride around, start looking for fish, and have fun on the Union to Alameda stretch. So we're going to jump to the next stretch here. We're going to go Alameda to I-70. This is kind of where I cut my teeth. This is Denver. This is where our new shop will be. It's carp country. When you see all the pictures on Instagram, when you read all the articles back in the early 2000s about the early carp scene, this is where it all went down. This is ground zero. So carp is number one. There are trout in this stretch. We're going to talk about that here in a minute. There's a pretty hard asterisk after the trout in this stretch. There's still some walleye, not a ton. Smallmouth bass, awesome. we start to potentially see largemouth bass in the stretch, and then channel catfish. Um, the trout in this stretch, we'll talk about this right now just because it is a big point of interest right now. Um, it's a unique instance where a private donor has, in the past 3 consecutive years, stocked 750 broodstock individuals at Elitch's. In 2017, they were stocked in early spring. If you remember 2017, it was a huge water year. The river was up over 2,000 CFS almost to late August. As such, the fish got dumped in. Not a lot of people knew about it. There wasn't a ton of pressure. The river came up. It was cold, fast water. They were pushed around, but there was almost no angling pressure. Because it was 2,000 CFS, there were no temperature issues. When the water came down into August and cooled down in September, October, there were dumb big trout, at least 750 of them everywhere. We had a lot of fun catching them, almost to the point where they were kind of annoying. You'd be set up on a really nice carp, you'd go make your presentation, a trout would dart out of nowhere and take your fly, and you'd kind of laugh it off. You see a picture on the bottom right of Yvonne holding a trout there at a night fishing session in the stretch, and that was out of that stocking. They held over. We were still catching some really nice trout in the early spring of 2018. There weren't 100% holdover. People had kind of figured it out. Some people had eaten them. We'll talk about that later, but definitely don't eat any trout out of the river, and not for conservation standpoint, because of some health issues. But they held over. They did great. 2018, if you remember, we had a really low water year, a drought year. There were more zero flow days out of Chatfield this year than there had been in a very long time. They stocked in spring. People knew more about it, so there was more angling pressure. Water temps rose almost to the 80s through midsummer. They didn't stick around long. There were a couple of fish that we found once temps cooled in the fall that held over. There are some deep spots and some cool things that Denver Trout Unlimited and some other folks have done to create lunker pipes, which are low flow oxygenated holding zones where fish can kind of get through high temps. So a handful did hold over, but it wasn't great. 2019, to avoid the temp issue, they stocked in November of 2019. By late November, December, through social media, everybody knew about it. There was 750 19 to 24 inch trout at Elitch's. There was, at any given day, 10 to 18 people lined up from REI up to the I-70 bridge. The fish just absolutely got beat up. They're still there. I've seen a couple in the past month. To be perfectly honest, I've seen more dead ones upstream and downstream due to either potentially angling pressure or not great holdover. It's not a real trout population. Can't be a real trout population. Some of the data we've garnered from it makes it promising to some changes we can make to potentially have trout down this far. But because you saw a guy on Instagram holding an 18-inch trout in front of Elitch's doesn't mean you can go down there right now and do it. Potentially you can. There's still a couple in there, but trout really aren't the story in this stretch. And as you begin to explore and get comfortable in this river, I strongly encourage you to look past trout because there's way better stuff out there. I'm very biased in the carp world, and I'll keep tooting the carp horn all day. I know that's not for everybody. It's challenging, and there's some unique things you have to learn to do it. But as we warm up daily, smallmouth fishing is going to get better and better. Walleye fishing is going to get better and better. These are things that you don't have to make a ton of changes to your angling if you're already a trout angler to chase. And you're going to maybe be disappointed if you go down to Elitch's tomorrow and try to catch a trout. You're not going to be disappointed if you go to one of the southern or northern stretches and try to catch a smallmouth. It could be a lot more fun. So one thing to note, and I kind of touched on this earlier, is there's not holes. There's not a Dorsey's hole. There's not a spectator hole. There's not a family hole at Cheeseman. Fish don't translate to holes like they do in trout rivers. Flows are constantly changing. There's over 100 water influxes from multiple creeks that come in, from whether they be as big as Bear Creek and Clear Creek or small like Lakewood Gulch. Much of the storm water from the metro area runs in through culverts. So after high rain events, the river can spike from 130 CFS to 1,000 CFS overnight, come back down to 2 to 300 CFS the next day. So things change a lot. There's also lots of places where water is pulled. The Burlington Ditch down in Commerce City pulls almost the entirety of the flows out, and for some parts of the year, the stretch between Franklin Avenue and the Metro Wastewater Treatment Plant is completely dry, and then it comes back in from the treatment plant, and flows are actually better and clearer and warmer than they are below. So you can't really bank on holes. You got to move, you got to travel, you got to look for the right holding water for the species you're targeting, or if you're fishing for carp, you got to look for carp, and you got to be willing to move. There's lots of days where I'll park at a parking access, I'll walk a half a mile of river, either clarity isn't right or I'm not seeing fish. I jump back in my car, I go upstream or downstream 4 or 5 miles depending on conditions. I get out of my car, and the first spot I touch, there's fish feeding. Don't throw your hands up. Move around, walk, look for fish, look for structure. That's how you're going to be successful on this river. The river can be trashy. I mean, it's an urban place. People litter. It's unfortunate. But even though it's trashy, water quality is really good. I've wet waded in this river for 15, 18 years. I've never gotten sick. Never heard of issues. Sometimes there are E. coli spikes in the river. After major rainstorms, there are E. coli spikes, and the governing bodies have actually done tests on this, and they've found that the E. coli comes from geese and people. So there's no sewage leaks. There's no gross, terrible human being influence stuff. There's too many geese in the metro because we've made it too comfortable for them, and people need to pick up after their dogs. That's where the bad stuff comes from. You're totally healthy and safe being in this river. Again, I noticed, I noted that you got to walk, use that map, start exploring. If it's your first time on the river, pick a stretch to walk. Don't even take a rod. Just go see what you can see. See if you can spot tailing carp. See if you can spot spook carp. See if you can spot foam lines that may hold trout. See if you can spot riprap structures that hold smallmouth. Get out there and explore. Again, there's 30 miles of public access. We have lots of area to kind of break up and move around and find cool places to catch fish. So we are going, oh, actually we got a couple questions here. Josh Reed, totally can catch a trout in Denver. Again, not so many in the Denver proper Mile High area right now, but if you head out towards Chatfield Reservoir, you can totally have a great trout fishing day. AJ McGuire, hey buddy, if anyone needs to get tattooed, go visit Dead Drift Tattoo when they're back open. AJ's the man. He's probably one of the best fish tattoo artists out there. Most of the fish in the river are commons, but there is totally mirrors in there as well. I think maybe in the last 15, 18 years or whatever it's been, I've caught 6 or 7 mirrors, so there's not a high abundance. I've seen 2 grass carp in the river. That was a long time ago and way far north, so there's not much in the way of grass carp. For those who aren't familiar with the differences between mirror and common and grass carp, common carp are the carp that are in the picture of Kyle on your, it would be your left as you're looking at it. Or I guess you're right because you have the same view that I do. Mirror carp are a genetic mutation where the carp have really random scale patterns. There's nothing wrong with them. They're not unhealthy. It's just a cool mutation. In the carp community, mirror carp are actually way more prized because they're rare. They have super cool scale patterns. Koi are actually genetically the same as common carp. They've just been bred like dogs over hundreds of years to have way different appearance structures, but genetically they're just plain old carp. Grass carp are a different species. Grass carp are still a Cyprinidae. They're still a minnow species, but they are from East Asia. They're vegetarian, so they're stocked for vegetation control. They're also stocked as triploids, so they don't reproduce. If they did, it could get bad and they can overpopulate. kind of like what's going on in the Mississippi River with another Cyprinidae species. So if you stock them out here, they have to be stocked as sterile. Sometimes they can get into the river from attached ponds and lakes, but they're definitely not super common. I wouldn't expect to see them too much out there. So let's jump into the last stretch we're going to talk about in the urban corridor, and then we will start to talk about the specific fish species. So I-70 to I-76 it's urban, it's gritty, it's industrial. Way fewer park access points, so it's more industrial access points. Parking gets a little bit sketchier as you get out here. Keep in mind that you don't want to park in front of a grow houses parking lot or a industrial shipping warehouses parking lot. You will get towed. Make sure you park in designated parking areas that are safe. I did my best to list those on the map, so check those out. Those of us who've been fishing this stretch for a long time, we call it the stink. The scent from Metro Wastewater Treatment Plant, from the Suncor Refinery, from all the grow houses and industrial operations, it amalgamates to form a pungent odor. It stinks. It's not unhealthy to breathe in, and quite frankly, once you start doing this a while, you start to associate that smell with catching fish and having fun, so it doesn't bug you so much. But if you ever heard someone refer to the stink, it's the river to the north of town through Commerce City. The carp population is super migratory in the stretch. Carp are really good at eating, and they're going to move to where food is. There's also some flow issues. As I noted, through a good portion of the year, the entirety of the flow of the river is pulled out through the Burlington Ditch, destined for Bar Lake, and it goes kind of stagnant and dry from there down to the Metro Wastewater Treatment Plant influx. And at Metro Wastewater, the water comes back in, sometimes higher CFS than it is being pulled out of. And from Metro Wastewater north out to Brighton, you can have great flows. And you could have really bad clarity above Franklin, and all of that dirty water could be sucked into the Burlington Ditch, and you could have crystal clear clarity below Metro Wastewater. So keep in mind that if one stretch is blown out or one stretch isn't ideal, there's lots of variation through the system, so you can move around and keep an eye on different other stretches and have good fishing no matter what. Right now, the stretch between the Burlington Ditch and Franklin is pretty green and kind of gross. Carp can do okay in that. Most other fish species can't. So it does kind of reduce the amount of, other species out there. But I mean, I have seen trout as far north as Sand Creek. The other thing that starts to come into play out here is largemouth bass. Because it's warmer and kind of slower flows, and because there's connected lakes and ponds that have largemouth bass, you do start to see largemouth bass in the river out here. So that's another added bonus species. Had a question from Eric on fishing through the section in Sand Creek Park. So Sand Creek itself has a bunch of major weir and drop structures as it goes through Commerce City, through the Suncor Refinery. As such, there's not fish passage. So Sand Creek to the east, my experience, doesn't really have much of a fish population from any standpoint, just because those fish can't move throughout. So there's some potential for them to get in from some other feeder creeks as you get further east towards Aurora, but I wouldn't count on there being much in the way of that in Sand Creek. So the confluence with Sand Creek, there's smallmouth and carp there. Again, it's condition dependent as to how it fishes, but there's totally fish. I mean, quite frankly, through the entirety of the river. We'll go through all these different fish species and just know that there's not good spots and bad spots. There's fish moving to find where the structure and the food is right, and you got to explore and find those spots. So we'll now kind of go over those fish species, and I'll kind of tell you flies, tackle, tactics, and most importantly, as we kind of talk about being able to move and move around, where to look for these fish species so you're successful. So the first fish species, and we'll change the slide here, that we're going to talk about is my absolute favorite, and that's common carp. Carp fishing is awesome. If you guys haven't tried it, you got to do it. It's not easy. There's a lot of learning curve. It's very different from what you're doing for trout fishing, but all of that is a plus in my book. It means that you're going to push outside your boundaries. You're going to have new experiences that you're going to figure out. And that's the cool thing about fly fishing is we can do it our entire lives and still have lots of stuff to learn. So I'm never going to get bored. I mean, I've been carp fishing for, like I said, I think it's like 16 or 17 years now. And I'm excited. I might get to go fish tonight, and I'm stoked. And I could probably get my butt kicked and get skunked, or I could catch a couple of fish. And doing it forever, I'm still not good at it, and that's awesome. It kind of reminds me of permit fishing. Like carp are definitely easier to feed than permit for sure. I think pretty much any fish species is easier to feed than permit, but it's pretty darn tough, and it keeps me coming back. So, like I noted, they are present through the system. Hey, Josh, I just saw your question. We'll talk about this later, but Barry Reynolds actually did write, or I'm sorry, excuse me. Barry Reynolds wrote a guidebook to fishing for carp, so I'm not going to try to step on those toes because Barry is saying it way better than I ever have. But Pat Dorsey, the man, Pat Dorsey, wrote a book called The Fly Fisher's Guide to the South Platte. He just recently updated it last year. Pat Dorsey knows more about every other stretch of the South Platte than probably any other human being on the planet. And he's also 800 times the fisherman I'll ever be. But he was nice enough to ask me to share some of my thoughts and knowledge on the Denver stretch of the South Platte. So I wrote a chapter for him in his book that contains almost all of this information. So you don't need to wait on my poor grammar and my writer's block for me to write a book on it. It already exists. Just go buy Pat's book. It's in there already. And his editing made me sound legible. So thank you, Pat, for doing that. So carp, they're present throughout the system. I mean, you could potentially catch carp from the Chatfield Dam until the river confluences with the Platte in Nebraska and creates the main Platte stem. Keep in mind, as after Commerce City, once you get towards Brighton, public-private property becomes an issue. So there's lots of hunting leases, there's lots of aggregate operations, there's lots of industrial operations out there. The river is not public on either side once you get north of Brighton. So after about 164th, pay attention to what you're doing. You could be trespassing. There's still fish out there, but you really got to be careful and work hard to find public access out there. So carp are active in a super wide temperature range. So you can go out potentially and catch them 365 days here in Colorado. I've caught them every month of the year, and all you need is a temperature upswing in the wintertime. One of those days that we see where the temp pops up to 50 or 60 degrees for that to increase their metabolism and get them feeding again. I have caught them as cold ambient temps is like low 20s. The water temps were probably in the high 30s. High ambient temps are never an issue. They may seek shade in like 100+ degree days, but the water temps are still going to have them feeding and most active. In the river, the average weight is 8 pounds. There's specimens up to 30 pounds present. My buddy Jeremy, who's an awesome carp angler and is guiding through the river here coming forward to teach people how to catch carp. He's caught, I think, 4 fish over 20 pounds already this year and 1 fish over 30 pounds already this year. He's really putting up some amazingly big fish, and it's just a testament to how healthy this river is. But most fish are about 7, 8, 9 pounds. So when people first start carp fishing and I see their pictures on Instagram, they're like, oh, caught a 20-pounder today. The reality is it was probably an 8-pounder. But those big fish do exist. I maybe catch 2 to 3 fish a year over the 20-pound class out of the river. But they're there, and you know they're big. I mean, a 20-pound carp is absolutely massive. I mean, difficult to hold as a strong human being. You got to kind of set them down and let them rest on the ground sometimes. So they're there and they're big. Carp are naturally reproducing in the river. Like I said, they were stocked in 1879 and have been chugging along since then. They're really hardy and they can spawn multiple times a year. Late April, early May is usually when you see the spawn in the river, and the spawning is quite a sight. They're broadcast spawners, so the female will essentially spew out eggs onto sticky places for them to catch, and a pod of 4 to 5 to 6 males will be backflipping behind her, trying to fertilize those eggs. It looks like cannonballs going off. They're backflipping and jumping and going crazy. Um, they don't have reds or anything like that. They're broadcast spawners, so the eggs stick to plants. You don't have to worry so much about waiting. They're probably going to do just okay, but if you know that there's some eggs on some stuff, maybe don't step on it. The males usually aren't feeding during the spawn. They will stage on the sides between kind of spawning dashes. Um, but quite frankly, if you can get close enough to a female, she's eating along while the males are spawning on her. So you'll see that mouth moving, and she's trying to garner protein while the males are crashing all over her. So you can totally feed the big females. The males won't be super interested in eating unless they've kind of taken a break to eat. So not unethical to fish for them spawning. It's challenging because they're going crazy and have way more things on their mind than eating flies, but you can totally do it. Carp are hard to catch on a fly, and that's the best part about them. They have a lot of things going for them from an evolutionary standpoint that keeps them on the cutting edge of being able to eat effectively. So us putting a chunk of fur and synthetic and glue tied to a metal hook isn't quite the greatest approach to it, but that's what makes it super fun. I just saw Jay have a question about spawning behavior causing them to jump. Yes and no. So during the spawn, you will see big females taking 3-foot leaps out of the water and then smashing on their bellies. It's just like brown trout and rainbow trout do. They're trying to break that egg sac so they can deposit them. The other reason that you see fish jumping other times of the year is regulation of their air bladders. So as the water warms up and the fish move shallower to start feeding, I actually learned this tidbit from Blake up at Ugly Bug Fly Shop while fishing the Pathfinder Reservoir with him. I had always never quite figured it out. I thought it was like a false spawning behavior, and he explained it super clearly. As the water warms up and they want to move shallower to eat, they jump out of the water, they fill their swim bladders with air so they can be more buoyant and more comfortably feed on the flats. As they move back to deeper water as the day closes or water temps cool, they jump again, they release air out of their swim bladder so they can be more dense and go down to deeper depths. So that's why they're jumping. We'll go over flies here in just a second, so just stay tight for that. But we're going to go back to how awesome carp are, and I'm going to keep tooting their horn. They're super hardy. They can tolerate low oxygen, and that's why they've done so well in this river over all people and the environment have thrown at them over the years. They can actually hear. Most fish just pick up vibration through their lateral line. Carp have a organ called the Weberian organ that they can actually physically hear sound. So when I'm walking down to take a shot and my cell phone goes off because work's calling, they heard that and they spook and I blew the shot. The other really cool but frustrating thing about carp is they emit a stress pheromone when they're spooked. So if there's 4 fish in a pod feeding and I step on a twig and spook the first one, he emits a stress pheromone and every other fish that can pick up that pheromone immediately spooks. And in moving water, sometimes 10 to 15 minutes that pheromone can wash downstream and they can reset. In still water, that pheromone can stick around for a half an hour and that whole pot of carp is not going to come back and start feeding again. So you really have to be aware of what you're doing when you're stocking these fish to make sure that you're not blowing them up. And there's a million other things that we're going to have to take into consideration when approaching these fish as we keep going down the line. They have super sensitive lateral line and 2 sets of barbels, one above the lip and one to the side of the lip. Barbels are an olfactory organ. They pick up scent. When we were kids, we had a worm or corn on a hook and you caught a carp really easy and caught another carp really easy. That's because those olfactory senses can pick up that scent from a huge distance away and come up and say, this is a tasty morsel, I'm going to suck it down. With my kids lately, because it's hard to fly fish with my kids, I've been doing a ton of European style bait fishing. Don't judge me. It's really cool. It's way more complicated than I ever thought. I'm buying a ton of gear again, even more fly fishing gear. If anyone wants to talk about it, it's a crazy rabbit hole to go down to. But I can't fly fish with my kids because it's not the safest, so bait fishing is an option. Um, when you get into the way that their scent systems or olfactory systems work and the crazy things you're doing to bring them in from far away with scents, it's insane how sensitive those olfactory organs are. The barbels, their nostrils, the inside of their mouth is a giant olfactory organ. They can pick up all kinds of scents. So when you have corn or a worm on a hook, they know that's real food. They're good at eating. They're going to come up and eat it. When you have some henback and a piece of a mop that you just mopped your floor with and a bunch of super glue tied to a hook, they're going to know really quick that this isn't real food. And that's what makes fly fishing for them such a challenge. They can know right away, as soon as their mouths touch that fly, that this isn't real food. And we'll talk about the eat here in a second, but it makes it really hard for us to stick them with a fly, which is pretty cool. They have color vision. They can literally see in color like we as humans can. Most trout species see in spectrum levels, so they see shades of gray. Carp see color. If I don't put red eyes on any flies because carp can see it. I don't use a ton of flash because carp can see it. If you're a fly tire, you're going to you need to do some work, and you're going to need to make sure that your colors are right and your colors are muted. I sight fish, 100%. I never blind fish for carp, and there's a couple reasons for that. One is it's most effective. Two is they have a very small window in front of their face that they're actively feeding at. It can be as small in the winter as 3 to 4 inches. It can be as big as the summer as 10 inches. But unless you're on a magical, like once a summer day, that the fish is going absolutely crazy for your flies, they're not on average going to move more than 10 inches to eat a fly. The likelihood of you putting a fly correctly in front of a fish's face in that 10-inch window without being able to see where that fish is and see how that fish is feeding is slim to none. I have caught fish blind casting. I have caught fish on Hail Marys. It's not impossible, but if you want to catch fish consistently, it's not the best tack to take. The other big reason for not blind fishing is indicator nymphing in the river with carp is a recipe for foul hookery. In the early days, trying to figure it out, having done it with other people, having gone back to trying it just to see if I was missing something, if you're nymphing for carp, you're on average 7, 8, 9 out of 10 times hooking them somewhere else in the mouth. For one, that's not super fun. For two, it's not super sporting. The really cool thing for me about carp fishing is watching them eat and having the challenge of catching them. The Instagram photo comes like 10th or 11th in the line of cool things to do for them. If they're hooked in the butt, it doesn't count. It's not fun. It's not cool. It's not great for the fish. You're not really showing that you're a cool angler by butt hooking them. If you, especially in the wintertime at low flows, have 15 to 20, 8 to 15 pound fish stacked up in a hole at 50 CFS, and you run a double nymph rig with split shot and 2 heavily weighted flies through the middle of it, you're going to hook something, and it's not going to be a carp in the mouth. There are instances in specific fisheries and specific places where nymph fishing is super effective, but in the South Platte River, it's not the most effective way to go, and it usually results in foul hookery. So I'm just going to leave it at that. I challenge you to get out and do it the fun way. Hopefully you'll appreciate it a little bit more. So to catch carp, to actually catch one, step one is to find happy feeding fish. And carp can be very moody, and you have to find a fish in the right mood, because if you piss off a carp that's not in the right mood, it's going to be highly likely that he spooks all of his friends, and then you have to walk a really far distance to find another happy fish. So what you're looking for is a fish with his mouth is moving, just like a trout in a tailwater. You want to see that mouth either up in the column or on a piece of structure or on the bottom in the substrate. That mouth is moving. He's actively eating. They need to be moving with purpose. If they're moving really fast upstream, they're either moving somewhere else to find food or they're spooked. That fish probably isn't going to eat. If there's no other fish around and you're not going to spook any other fish by taking a shot, sure, take the shot. There's a small potential he may eat. If there's other fish around and you take that shot and you blow it and he spooks, you've ruined all your other shots. So get good about picking happy fish. The best two scenarios for happy fish are tailors and fish feeding on structure. So a tailor is just like we'd see in bonefish or redfish or permit. It's a fish with his face down in the substrate, eating away, moving slowly but with purpose, moving for food, and that tail up in the air wagging. We're looking for tailors. That's my favorite way to catch a fish. The other fish that's a really high percentage of conversion ratio is a fish eating on structure. So if there's a log or a shopping cart or a big clump of weeds or something else that's in the river that their fishes face into picking at, it's a little more challenging to get your fly in front of them because you have to not get snagged on that structure. But that fish is actively feeding, and he's usually a little less distracted by other stuff that's going on in his peripheral. So you can get closer to him and approach him and have a better shot at feeding him. The last kind of feeding behavior that you see in carp is klooping, where they're up on the surface, picking stuff out of the surface film. This doesn't happen as much on the Denver South Platte just because it's moving water, but there are big like foam swirls and there's eddies and sloughs where fish could totally be up on the surface klooping. The challenge for klooping fish is their eyes are looking up, so they're way more likely to detect you in their peripheral and get spooked. And it's hard to get a fly in front of them. When it's on the substrate, you can get the fly in the pocket and adjust it and get it in the zone. When it's up on the column, you're up here trying to juggle your rod and keep it in the zone. And kloopers are totally feedable. It's just way more challenging. Eats. You can't feel it. You have to see. That's the reason that sight fishing is so important. Unless a fish sucks it down with unbelievable gusto, which doesn't happen a ton, you're never going to feel the eat. Carp have a projectile mouth. So this is my fly sitting on the substrate. The carp comes up, his mouth is retracted, it projects out, it opens up, it engulfs the fly. As soon as the mouth touches the fly, those olfactory organs are saying, this isn't real food, and he immediately retracts. So you need to see that mouth drop over your fly. You need to be able to see your fly. There's actually a little white line here that separates the bottom lip from the top lip. When you see that white line, you need to set the hook. Hook sets are determined by location. If you are like less than a couple feet of fly line out of the tip, my absolute favorite way to catch fish is to stalk them closely. So I'll go as far as wearing camo. I watch my step. I don't crunch leaves. I'll walk down to the fish. I'll get behind a log or a tree or a bridge piling, and most of my shots are a rod's length away from the fish, where all I'm doing is reaching out and setting my fly in the zone, him not seeing me because I've done such a good job of sneaking up on him, and dropping in the zone, watching him eat. At that point, I'm trout setting. That's by far the most efficient way to transfer energy. If I was to strip set and drop my rod, tighten my line, come tight, I would have already missed the eat, and I wouldn't have the proper tension to set it. If I have more than about 5 feet of fly line out, I have my rod tipped down, then I'm going to strip set. That's a way more efficient transfer of energy. And if I miss the eat, there's potential that he could continue to move and try again, or I can pick it back up and put it back in the zone. The one downside of a strip set is you usually one strip is you're moving that fly 8 to 10 inches, and that oftentimes rips it out of the zone. So strip set's most efficient at distance, but you got to get it back in the zone if you miss them. Trout set is most efficient up close. The really good news about carp is if you hook them on the inside of the mouth with a barbed hook, there's very little, so long as you're using the appropriate tackle and your knots are good, that they can do to break you off. If you bury a hook in that gummy mouth, they're not coming off. It's pretty cool that you know that they're not going to spit the hook, they're not going to jump. You're going to catch that fish if you caught them in the mouth. So that's a cool plus side about carp that does make them a little bit easier to land. Line maintenance is critical. When water temps warm above 65, there's a good chance that every fish is going to take you into your backing. If you don't have your line maintained, you're going to wrap around a shopping cart or wrap around your leg or wrap around a bridge piling. And that's one point where even if you're using heavy tippet and your knots are good, there's got to be a break point or an end point. If that fish has you wrapped around and it runs downstream and it can't get to the reel with an appropriate amount of drag, you could potentially, I've straightened hooks out, I've broken flies off just because there's nowhere else for that fish to go. Don't baby the fight. You can put wood to these fish. Like I said, if you hooked them in the mouth with a barbed hook, it's not coming out unless they wrap you around something or you have a crummy knot. On the PowerPoint right now, I have 8 to 12 pound fluoro. Honestly, in the past year and a half to 2 years, I switched to 16-pound fluoro. I don't see fish reacting to the size of the tippet, and I can really hit them hard, get them in quickly, minimize the time of the fight, minimize the likelihood of them running me into something bad from a structure standpoint, and get them back in the water quickly. Tie your flies on quality hook, Tiemco hooks, Gamakatsu hooks. Leave those weird off-brand Instagram hooks at home. I've straightened them out. You want good quality hooks. Practice your knots. This is no place for a surgeon's knot. It's a terrible knot. You want a blood from leader to tippet and some type of quality knot to the fly. I use a Perfection loop right now. A no-slip mono loop also works good. If you don't like loop knots and you want a standard knot, an unimproved clinch knot will work in a pinch too. But don't mess around with surgeon's knots. Get good quality knots. They will test them. When you're fighting them, use low rod angles, very similar to saltwater species. Drop that rod tip, get it down, put lots of pressure on them, keep them from running. But I mean, if they got to go, they got to go. So let them hit the reel. Once they start to gulp air on the surface, so the fly, they're up in the column, the fly's hooked in their mouth, and they start to kind of take in air. Usually they're done and ready to be landed. So what do you need to catch? 6 to 7 weight fly rod. If you only have 5 weight, don't let it stop you. It's not ideal. You're going to get your butt kicked sometimes, but still go out and fish for them. I generally use a 6 in the winter and then a 7 or 8 depending on flows in the summertime. Large arbor reel with a good quality drag. Fish are going to take you into backing in the summertime, so be prepared for that. Floating fly line in a muted color. Some of those really bright orange and bright green lines, fish are going to pick up that in the peripheral and potentially spook on it. So if you minimize false casting, that's an even better way to do it. You want to make sure that you're getting the fly in front of them as few casts as possible, but having a muted color fly line will definitely help. And then I use super short leaders. There's lots of other really good carp anglers out there that use really long leaders, and there's not a right or a wrong. It's for their style. I like to not have to cast. I like to get close to the fish. I like to have a ton of control over my fly. So most of my leaders are 7.5 foot length down to 16 pound. Fluorocarbon, of course, all the time. Fish will spook on mono. You get that refraction of light through mono that kind of distorts the spectrum. Fish get a little weirded out on that, so definitely use fluoro. Fluoro is also way more abrasion resistant, and there's lots of stuff that you can abrade on in this river. So use fluoro. But I like short leaders. I've compensated for that by not false casting a bunch, by having good control over my presentation, and by not being splashy. If you find that you're spooking them with your fly line, you can extend your leader, but then you have less control over your fly. So presentation is paramount in this fish. Fly selection, as we're going to talk about here in a second, doesn't matter all that much as long as you present it right. Weight does matter a ton, and we'll talk about that here in flies, but presentation is paramount. So flies. In the river, I like heavy flies. There are other people that I fish with on a regular basis that still catch as many, if not more than me, fish in the river on light flies, but I like heavy flies. I like the idea that I find a feeding fish, I use the drag and drop technique, which we'll talk about in the next slide, and get it in the pocket quickly, and that way it maximizes the time that I have for that fish to react. If I'm waiting for a fly to flutter down, especially with current pushing it downstream, there's a potential that that fish can either see me or that he can move upstream or downstream or stop feeding. If I know if I have a heavy fly and I present it right, I can get it down in front of that feeding fish quickly, and he's going to eat. Um, so that's why I like heavy flies. So this is a carp mop tied by a really awesome carp tyer here in Denver, Daryl Angler, who runs Nervous Waters Flies. He tied these special for me, extra, extra heavy. These are way heavier than any of the flies that he ties just for my style. This is a lead barbell eye. It's wrapped with lead wraps. This fly gets down quick, but it also is a slim profile, so it cuts through the water and isn't super splashy, even though it's heavy. So I have kind of the best of both worlds, that I'm not splashy, but I get down in the pocket quickly. Most of my flies are mimicking crayfish or cranefly larvae. Um, that's not exclusively what carp eat. Carp are crazy voracious omnivores. They eat everything. They eat worms. They eat baetis. They eat small minnows at times. I mean, they eat a bazillion different things. So the good news is because they eat so much stuff, if you put a fly in front of them that looks like something they've eaten in the past and you make it look like food, they're going to eat it if you present it right. You just have to keep in mind that you're trying to get it down in the zone where they're feeding, and in the river you're dealing with a current, so that water is pushing it downstream. If you don't have a heavy fly, you could cast in front of the fish and the current could push it, so when it finally hits the substrate, it's behind its tail. So you need to compensate for the flow in the river with the weight of your fly. Answer a couple of questions about flies that have just popped up. Layla, the big goldfish. Goldfish are also a Cyprinidae as well, so they eat very similar to carp, except for the fact that they're way pickier. They actually nip at things. If you ever watch a goldfish in your tank, the way they nip at the flakes, it's kind of how they eat. So this is a really small, like a size 12 rubber-legged hare's ear with barbell eyes. This is what I fish for goldfish in some of those ponds that have goldfish. It's essentially just a really small version of a carp fly. J, flies that I use for surface eaters. Um, Dragon and damselfly larvae work great for surface eaters, as do like vegetable matter when it's appropriate. So cottonwood seeds, when there's cottonwoods falling on the surface, that's totally a great pattern to use for surface eaters. Let me pull out another one of Daryl Angler's flies that I really like for surface eaters. Let me find it in the bag here. It's called the Hipster Doofus. It's a really lightweight fly. It's just got a thin bead chain eye in it. I don't know if you can see it in the plastic. And then it has a dub body, so it just hangs in the water column just below the surface film. And I try not to dress any of my floating flies because silicone floatants have a smell to it, and carp are really good at picking up on funky smells. Um, but just holding it up in the column is usually the best way to go. As far as size, it's whatever's appropriate to the forage. Most of the crayfish in the river are pretty small. So this is my favorite crayfish pattern. This is Barry's carp fly. I'm going to try to hold it up so everyone can see it. There'll be pictures on some of the other slides. But this is about a size 6 or 8, depending on the way you tie it or the way you do it. This is designed by Barry Reynolds, my carp idol. It's got great weight. It's on a great hook profile. It's generic enough that it kind of looks like a crayfish, but kind of looks like a bunch of other stuff. This is by far one of the best South Platte River flies out there. This is an Umpqua feather merchant's fly too, so it's super high quality. One that I've been liking in the winter. A lot of the crayfish are lighter and bodied right now as they're kind of moving into molt. So this is the Solitude Chickaboo craw. This actually has a foam top, so it lands nice and soft, and it has a lead barbell eye, so it gets down in the pocket, and it's that lighter body. This is, again, a 6 to an 8. This has been working really well for me through the winter. And another pattern that I really like a ton is mott flies. I've recently started fishing in tandem, so 2 flies, even when I'm sight fishing. I learned that from a guy, John Montana, who does a cool carp blog. And the reason that I do the 2 flies is twofold. One, so I have a lighter body fly on the top so I can track it and have good viz on where my flies are as they approach the fish. And 2, if for some reason my bottom fly swings out because there's too much current or I didn't set up right, there's a potential that I can still present the top fly in front of the fish. You want to gap them quite a bit, like 24 inches, so you don't have any foul hooking issues. And actually, Christine, I'm talking about this right now as the two flies scenario. So you can totally do two flies. Again, you have the advantage of being able to track your flies more efficiently and drop that second fly into the pocket if you miss the first pocket. The downside to two flies is it's way harder to handle and present both. And if you don't present right, there's potential for foul hooking issues. So you can overcompensate for the foul hooking stuff just by like getting better at the presentation, but as a beginner, it may be tough. And the really big downside to foul hooking carp is usually when you foul hook them, you get them in the scale pattern, and after enough of a fight, it rips off a big chunk of scales, and that exposes them to potential disease and fungal infections and things like that. So ripping a big patch of scales off a carp isn't great for them. They're party fish; they'll be okay. It's just they're a resource, and we should respect that and try not to cause any major impact. Um, I have all these flies listed down here. If you want to give us a call at the shop, we can pick out flies for you. We also have on our website our staff pick selections that we can ship right now, even though we can't physically be open in the shop. We can ship all kinds of stuff to you. So if you pick that staff pick selection, there's a 9 out of 10 chance that I'll be the one picking it for you. So either send me a note if you're fishing lakes or ponds. I can pick out specific lakes or pond flies. If you're fishing the river, I can pick out flies specific to the river for you. So now's a great time to go out and fish for carp. I'm happy to give you as much info as I can. And if you want me to pick flies for you, even though you can't come see me in the shop, I'll totally do it over the web. So use that option as well. So sorry for those that aren't into carp for my long-windedness on carp. I have one more slide here about presentation for carp, and then we'll get into some of the other species here in the river. So this next, when it populates, is the drag and drop technique. And this is probably the most important skill set to learn when fishing for carp. As I noted, carp have that feeding window in front of them of 8 to 10-ish inches in prime conditions, 4 to 6 inches in cold conditions, that they're going to actually move to eat a fly. Carp get so big because they don't waste a bunch of energy chasing down food sources. They kind of move to it slowly. They get a bunch of food and they don't dart around a bunch. So that's why carp are big, is they're not wasting a bunch of energy eating. They're just eating efficiently. So they're not going to move 1.5 feet, 2 feet to chase down your fly. The big challenge is, as we know, carp can hear us. Carp can see us really good. Carp can smell us and smell our flies. And carp have really good motion detection in their peripheral. So they can, even though they can't focus on you when you're up and out of the water, they can see you false casting a bunch, or they can see you waving your rod around a bunch. So they're potentially going to spook because of that. So we use a technique called the drag and drop presentation. And if you're want to keep going on YouTube after you're done watching this, if you just scroll through our videos and go to On the Water, there is a drag and drop video that Yvonne and I filmed last summer that goes through this in way more depth. So watch that video. Don't laugh at my goofiness too much, and see if it can help you go out and catch some carp. But the ideal thing is we want to get our fly in the zone without spooking them. So a couple things to mind. Actually, we'll go over the drag and drop first. So what we want to do is we want to cast past the fish, either 5 to 6 feet on the flank, the right or left flank, or if you look in that diagram, that blind spot that V's out behind the tail, we want to let our fly splash in that zone. We want to lift our fly up in the water column so it's just on the top of the surface area, and we want to deliberately, not super fast, but deliberately drag the fly across the surface film so much so that it even creates a small V-wake, and then come up in front of the fish, whether it's either from the right or left side or from behind, and drop it slowly and deliberately into the pocket so it lands right in the zone of the fish. 2 to 3 inches in front of the feeding mouth is about where you want it to land. And we have to keep in mind that in the river, there is a current. So instead of just dropping it down and hoping it's going to hit that zone, we need to drop it well in advance so that the current pushes it down and it hits the pocket. Once it hits the pocket, don't strip. Don't even move. Um, we call it subtle fleeing action. If you strip right away, that fish isn't going to chase after it. You just stripped it out of the zone. See what the fish does. So as soon as it hits the pocket, in most cases, if you're within 2 to 3 inches, that fish is either going to eat or he's going to realize something's wrong and he's going to spook and get the hell out of there. So as the fly hits, watch what the fish does. If the mouth drops on the fly, set. If he spooks, go find another fish. If for some reason that fly is sitting there and he's still just moving around here, think about a crayfish in defense. Crayfish is our biggest forage in the river. When a crayfish gets upset, it doesn't scoot away super fast. The first thing it does is it pops those claws up and it gets in defense mode. So what we want to do is drop your rod tip or lift your rod tip up and just get that fly with those barbell eyes to pop up and twitch. And just the slightest little tip action just to get it to twitch. That's usually what gets the fish to feed. If fish still is moving around and not feeding and your fly is up there popping, then just the slightest, not even a strip, just a rod tip twitch it a little bit. Just kind of get it moving. And hopefully that'll trigger the fish to eat. If for some reason you've moved it out of the zone and the fish still hasn't eaten, slowly move it even further till you're maybe 2 or 3 feet in front of the zone, then pick it up and try it again. If the fish is still eating, you can continue to get shots on him and try to drop it in that zone. But in most cases, as soon as the fly hits the substrate, he's going to eat or he's going to spook. Keep in mind that prey never swims towards a predator. The worst thing you can do is have a fly come from the side at the fish's eyes or come from the front towards the fish's mouth. If you're a crayfish that's about to get swallowed by a fish that's 10 times your size, you're not going to swim closer to him and just get chowed on. You're going to get away. That's another reason that nymphing doesn't necessarily work. Carp don't usually waste the energy to get up in the system and eat stuff that's coming to them. So if you slide something big towards them, they're going to know right away that this isn't real food. It shouldn't be swimming towards me. They're going to spook. And again, if the fish doesn't eat and it doesn't see you twitch it out of the zone, pick it up, put it right back in the zone. So that's all I have on carp for right now. I teach a couple schools a year on carp fishing. They're on water in classroom schools. We'll break this all down 100 times more. If you want to get involved in, crossing my fingers that we'll be good to go on schools in May. So I have a date on May 9th and then one again on June 6th. Give us a shout at the shop. We'd love to get you out on the water and teach you how to carp fish. Again, it's challenging and there's some muscle memory and some changes you have to make in your angling. But once you get the basic hints down, you're still going to get your butt kicked, but you're going to have a lot of fun doing it. So again, always happy to answer questions. We'd love to have, I think the May carp school is filling up pretty quick, but we'd love to have you in the June or August carp school. So just reach out to me, let me know. But now we're going to talk about some other stuff besides carp. That's still fun to catch. So the next species is trout. This is what's most familiar to everyone. It's still fun to catch, and in the river, they are usually really nice specimens. The fish that I'm holding in this picture was, I think, in October or November this year. This was a holdover from the 2018 mile high stocking. So that fish made it through the high temps, ate a bunch of crayfish, got super colored up, got big, and once the water temps cooled down, was there eating again. And he chased down a woolly bugger, probably 15 to 20 feet. We actually spotted him and sight fished him, and it was a pretty awesome eat. So the trout fishing can be cool. Again, cooler temperatures are the best time to target trout. October through May is probably your best bet to have consistent trout fishing, and it's your best bet for being kind to the fish. Keep in mind, 65 degrees or warmer can have a really bad impact on the fish. 70 degrees or warmer is going to kill it. So if you're fishing in the middle of August and water temps are in the 80s and you hook a trout, it's going to die. That's not great. There's not a lot of them in there, so be nice to them. The trout respond a little bit to traditional insect hatches. I mean, I have caught them on dry flies, Baetis most often, But quite frankly, they're hood trout. They're good at eating what's in the river, and they like big meals too, just like the carp and the smallmouth do. My best success has been on streamers, and of course carp flies. They eat crayfish, they eat minnows. I like to, when I'm trout fishing, either sight fish for them or work the appropriate runs with streamers. That's my favorite way to do it. Um, we talked about the Metro Denver stocking. Again, there's not much left of the 2019 stocking. They're there, but I wouldn't count on having a great day. I think if you want to catch trout, I would either go to the Chatfield tailwater or start messing around Bear Creek for browns. Um, Indicator nymphing for trout can totally be effective. Um, Sight fishing and streamer fishing is just as effective and way more fun. Um, Eric, thoughts on hoot owl hours in the summer? There's not enough trout in there to really matter. Um, the likelihood of you catching a trout in the summer is pretty darn slim, so I wouldn't worry about it. Every other species in there is a cool to warm water species, and they thrive in those summer temps, so wouldn't be an issue. In the Chatfield tailwater, those water temps are coming out at that 42-degree range, just like they are at Deckers, so those fish will be just fine up there. If you happen to catch a trout in the summer, if it comes together, just get it in quickly. Don't touch it. Leave it in the water. Get the hook out and release it. But it's pretty unlikely that that's even going to happen, so I wouldn't even worry about it. Um, again, these fish are trout, and they hold in trout structure. They like pools below riffles. They like deep troughs on bends. My biggest indicator of where I'm going to find trout when I'm actively trout fishing is foam. Foam means oxygen. Because of the way this river is structured, oxygen is not in super abundance the way that trout likes it. So if you're looking for trout, look for foam. That means there's oxygen and there's food. The foam is more than just about any other river I've seen their home in this river. Um, Most individuals are super healthy. They have to be to survive the unique challenges of this place. There's lots of avian predators. I see blue herons, I see pelicans, cormorants, I see hawks, I see peregrine falcons, lots of stuff from above that can eat. So usually the smarter, healthier, bigger individuals are the ones that are going to survive. Um, Water quality is great. You're not going to get sick from the water, but because of the nature of this river and because it was a heavy mining river throughout its history, there are very high arsenic levels. It's not from pollution, it's a natural kind of residue of the way the river's been cut and dredged and redredged. But if you eat these fish, the arsenic levels are super high and it's not great for your body. So I wouldn't recommend eating anything out of the river just because of the high arsenic levels. What do we need to catch trout in the river? Same stuff you need to catch trout everywhere else. 5 or 6 weight fly rod. The fish are big and they're sporty, so they are going to test your drag more so than they would in, say, Clear Creek. But you don't need anything special. They're not leader shy. You don't need 5X, you don't need 6X. 4X and 3X is just fine. If you're fishing streamers, streamers are expensive. 10 to 12 pound fluoro is what I'm using. The fish tend to prefer larger meals. If I'm indicator nymphing, I usually use a mott fly as a point, and then like a size 16 flashy nymph, something that could be a Baetis or a caddis, depending on time of year. When those trout were at mile high earlier in the season, a size 16 rainbow warrior behind a mott fly was money. Streamer fishing, I like crayfish color and white. Large stonefly imitations work great. There's not a huge stonefly population in the river, but I've caught carp, trout, smallmouth bass, suckers on Pat's rubber legs. Pat's rubber legs are always a great choice. And then if you're dry fly fishing, match the hatch. There's Baetis popping on the river right now. I bet you with the cloud cover that's going on right now, if you were to walk down to the river as we speak, there's probably some fish rising to Baetis. So trout or trout, no matter where they're at. Just you can use bigger stuff here than you can at Deckers. Streamer fishing is way more effective here than it is at Deckers. Just keep in mind that the population density is slim, so you're not going to go post up in a hole and catch a dozen trout. You have to keep moving. You have to keep working proper water. If you want to catch trout in the river, plan on walking a lot. Plan on trying 7 or 8 different holes. And after you get 1 or 2 out of a hole, plan on moving because there's probably not any more in there. So we're going to move on from trout to smallmouth bass on the next slide. As I noted, smallmouth bass are really going to be what makes this river special in the coming years. I've seen the population just explode and grow in both quantity and quality every year. It's self-sustaining. We don't have to, as a wildlife agency or anyone who's managing the fishery, really do anything except for make sure that there's abundant, healthy water in the system, and the fish are going to grow. Smallmouth are, like all temperate basses, most active in warmer temperatures. The smallmouth started coming to life on the river in the past week and a half to 2 weeks. I was out 2 weeks ago at the outflow of a water treatment plant that's a little bit warmer than the rest of the river, catching smallmouth. As the rest of the river comes up and warms up, the smallmouth are going to get super active. After the last couple warm days, I don't think it's prime smallmouth season yet, but I bet you can go out and catch a couple. Most of the fish are 10 to 14 inches, so kind of the one on the right there, about that size, but there's fish up to 4 or 5 pounds. I mean, I've seen legitimate 18, 19, 20-inch smallmouth in the river. Excuse me there. They entered the system from Chatfield, Bear Creek Reservoir, and a bunch of the other connected ponds in the southern stretch. I've seen them as far north as Brighton. They're really endemic to the system right now, and they're an awesome species because, one, they pull harder than trout. Two, they're really pretty. You hear a lot of arguments that carp are ugly or carp are not ugly. I personally think carp look great, but you can't argue that a smallmouth bass isn't a pretty fish. Two, they eat a lot like trout, so you don't have to learn a ton of new techniques to catch them. And three, they again pull way harder than trout, so they're a lot more fun. You can catch them indicator nymphing with stonefly larvae, leeches, kind of bigger general attractor nymphs. You can catch them streamer fishing. You can catch them sight fishing. You can catch them on poppers in the river. I've done it in the really ideal conditions. You can throw a little frog popper and catch smallmouth in the river. They're the perfect fish species. They're bass, so they translate to structure. So that's the one thing you keep in mind when you're looking for them, is they're adjacent to some piece of structure waiting to ambush prey. So riprap piles, shopping carts, bridge pilings, log jams, any type of structure that they can hang behind, and as the current pushes something towards them, dart out and grab and pop back into the structure. That's where they're going to be. They like deeper water and cold temps. They can be in as skinny as 6 inches in warmer temps, and you can totally sight fish them. Outflows, tributary junctions, places where water temp changes dramatically and quickly, usually when warmer water is coming in, that's a prime spot to catch them throughout the year. In the heat of summer, maybe not so much. They're going to translate to maybe a cooler influx, like a creek influx. Places where water temps changes and there's structure, that's always going to be a great place to find smallmouth. Like everything in the river, most fish are healthy, they're fat, they're full of food, they have high stamina. They're pretty darn cool fish to chase with a fly rod. Absolutely, Layla. Smallmouth are super fun to catch. We don't really have many smallmouth opportunities here in the West. In the Mid-Atlantic and the Southeast, there's awesome smallmouth fishing, and this river could potentially be our kind of little version of that here in the West. What do you need to catch smallmouth? Nothing special. 5 or 6 weight rod. Large arbor fly reel is nice, but it's pretty rare that they're going to take you to backing. Short, stout leaders for streamer fishing. Trout leaders, 4X, 3X. They eat a lot of different stuff. They'll eat crayfish. They'll eat small bait fish. They'll eat stoneflies and hellgrammites. They'll eat nymphs. They'll eat all kinds. They eat carp flies. Woolly buggers, like Chris just mentioned. When we're carp fishing, we get what's called bass blocked a lot, where you'll lay your fly in front of a feeding carp and a smallmouth will dart out and grab it. They eat carp flies, especially when you don't want them to eat carp flies all the time. Smallmouth are awesome. I mean, enough said about that. They're not super hard to catch as soon as you can find where they're at. They're pretty. They pull hard. Go smallmouth fishing. It's a really cool resource that we have right in our backyard. So next, we're going to move on to walleye. As we go down the line of these fish species, we're talking about species that get less abundant in the drainage. So walleye, while present throughout the system, aren't quite as available throughout, particularly as you move further north. The highest density is in the southern stretch, directly below Chatfield Reservoir, where they're coming in out of the dam system. Um, Walleye are low light feeders. It's not to say you can't catch them on a bright sunny day, but because of the way their eyes work, they tend to be more predatory in low light. So cloudy days, overcast days, evening, nighttime, those are the times to go catch walleye. I fish the river at night all the time for walleye and for carp. The carp fishing at night is really, really challenging. It requires a lot of like really specialized skills, headlamps that you don't directly throw on the fish, overhead lights, really complicated stuff. I even have a light up stripping basket so I can maintain my line. Walleye, you just got to find a deep hole, have either a heavy fly or a sinking line and a clouser minnow, and you can catch all kind of fish at night. So I work a ton, and I have two little kids. I don't get to fish during the day that much, but usually I can talk my wife into letting me go out for a couple hours at night after work. Walleye are the perfect species for that because they eat at night and they eat more efficiently at night. Fish in the river average 10 to 12 inches, but there's big ones in there. I mean, I've seen them up to 8 pounds. Um, they get in through Chatfield, Bear Creek, the numerous connected ponds. There's a bunch of adjacent ponds through Littleton and the southern stretches that have walleye in them. Walleye primarily eat bait fish and leeches, so therefore streamer fishing is the way to go. I've seen them caught on nymph rigs, but it's pretty rare. Usually streamer fishing is what you're doing. A chartreuse and white clouser is number one. A red and white seducer is number two. Some type of either white or rust colored or black bugger is number three. Don't have to get super crazy with fly selection. Sink tips can definitely increase productivity in the Chatfield dam holes. Directly below the dam and below the first weir, those are pretty deep holes, and I do recommend sink tips or shorter sinking lines there. Through the rest of the river, just heavy flies are usually your best. Um, Fish like the deepest, darkest places, so you're looking for those slower, deeper runs. That's where they're going to hold. If you catch a fish in the state park, so long as it's within state wildlife regulations, it's totally safe to eat. Walleye are absolutely delicious. Um, I'll if I catch a fish that's within regulations in the state park, I'm totally going to take it home and throw it in a beer batter and eat it. Below the state park, you do have the arsenic issues, so I would avoid eating fish below the state park. As far as gear, while I don't fight super hard, they're kind of like wet socks when you catch them, so you don't need anything major for the fight. You do need heavier flies to get down deep in those pockets, or a sinking tip definitely helps. They're not leader shy at all. 10 to 12 pound fluorocarbon, chartreuse and white clousers, leeches. The red and white seducer over the last year has become one of my favorite walleye flies. However, because it's unweighted, you have to fish it on a sink tip. So walleye are super, super fun to catch. If you can catch them in eating size, they taste good. They're cool looking. It's all streamer fishing. Go out and try walleye if you've never done it before. Right now is prime time for walleye. It is the ideal conditions from now until mid-April to go out and catch walleye. So if you're looking for something to do to get out of the house right now, walleye fishing is going to get better and better over the next 3 to 4 weeks, and you can have a ton of fun catching. All right, so we're going to talk about a couple more low-density species here. We're going to go to the next slide. We're going to talk about largemouth bass and channel catfish. Largemouth bass are mostly in the northern stretches of river and have entered through the various connected lakes and ponds throughout Adams County as you move towards Brighton. There are some largemouth bass in the southern stretches as well, just not as abundant. Most of the bass you catch in the river are pretty tiny. Lots of like 4, 5, 6 inch fish. But there are nicer specimens caught on occasion. I mean, I've seen a couple 2, 3 pounders come out of the river. One of the other reasons they tend to be further north is They prefer slower to stagnant water. They don't like the moving water like smallmouth bass and trout do. So as you get further north, that river really slows down and widens up, and you find them in the sloughs and pockets and the non-moving stuff. And like all bass, they're structure oriented, probably way more so than most of the other temperate bass. Largemouth bass hold to structure, and that's where you're going to find them. Log jams, bridge pilings, shopping carts, those are where the largemouth bass are. So look for that slow water, look for the structure. That's where you're going to find them. I I find that they're pretty dumb. They don't see a lot of pressure. They've got big mouths. They like to eat. If you find largemouth in the river, usually you can catch them. They're not super challenging in regards to the species that are in there. Um, I like to use finesse style bass patterns pretty much across the board here in Colorado. So jig style stuff, McKittrick's Jawbreaker, Senko style chenille worms. Umpqua has an awesome pattern called the worm slider. That's actually what's hanging out of that bass on the bottom's mouth. But you can catch them on streamers. You can catch them on woolly buggers. In the very right conditions, you can catch them on poppers. Um, they're not picky. They're fun to catch. Not huge abundance, but you can totally catch them. The last published fish I'll talk about, I have an unpublished one I'll talk about as well, is the channel catfish. Um, these ones, it's pretty difficult to target them consistently. There's a couple guys out there. Patrick from Urban Anglers USA has probably done it better than anyone else I know that have found a way to catch them fairly consistently. But mostly it's an accidental catch. They're in the system. They're big. The state record was actually standing in the tail race below Chatfield through most of the early 2000s until it was broken a couple times out of Aurora Reservoir. I mean, fish in the 25 to 30 pound class, big catfish. Uh, a recent survey found fish up to 31 inches. I've caught them. The one in that picture is probably about 8 or 9 pounds. Um, they're big catfish. They're catfish I never caught. They rip. They pull hard. They head shake. They pull line. Um, they're just tough to target. They like warm temperatures. They like deep pools and slow water. So it's just difficult to find them since you can't really sight fish for them. Um, it's yeah, my beard was much shorter then. Thanks, Yvonne. They're definitely around. I wouldn't plan on catching a bunch of them, but they can pop up and they can be a ton of fun. And if you really want to challenge, go find a really deep trough and slow strip some type of bait fish or some type of woolly bugger, like a jigged woolly bugger would work awesome. And if you hook one, I mean, you're going to be in for a ride. They rip hard. So get out there and find a catfish. I mean, they're kind of the unicorn of the river right now. So if you can find a catfish out there, you're doing something really cool. The last fish species I'm going to talk about, and I didn't put this in the presentation because I was afraid people would make fun of me, but there's native white suckers in the river, and they're big white suckers. Um, I am fairly confident that if I keep with it, I am going to catch the state record released white sucker out of the river, and I'm going to be so excited to put a plaque above my desk that says I hold the state record for the sucker. Um, they're big, they're in there. They eat nymph rigs. They stack up in super slow holes. You can even sight fish for them in certain places when the clarity is right. So if you're really bored and you want to catch something cool, go find a really deep, slow hole, and you may catch a catfish. You may catch the state record sucker. No matter what, you're going to get a bend in your rod, and you're not going to have to drive 2.5 hours to do it. You can drive 8 minutes to do it. When we have the new shop, I'll be able to walk out the back door and go fishing after work. Right now, I leave work and I'm on the river in terrible Denver traffic in under 10 minutes. That's a cool resource. I can go out and have my fishing fix and not have to deal with other people, deal with traffic, deal with driving. I can be on fishable water in less than 10 minutes. And that's a win for me. The last thing we really need to talk about is safety. Um, so we're in an urban environment, and we need to take some special considerations as far as it's considered with safety. Um, the river's safe. I've been fishing it, like I said, this is 17, 18, whatever years, and I have, outside of my own clumsiness, never had a negative experience. Um, there are people around all the time, cycling, hiking, floating the river in kayaks. Um, there's usually almost always someone else around. The plus side to that is if something happens, you fall and get hurt, there's a negative occurrence, there's someone there who can help you at any time. The other reality of that, though, is watch your back cast. There's a bike path adjacent to the entire river. If you back cast and hook somebody with your hook, um, I mean, we know fly lines break at a very low test strength. You're not going to like rip them off their bike or anything like that, but a cyclist is going to be super pissed that you put a hook in their arm, and it's going to be a bad interaction. Just pay attention, be courteous of the other people out there. Um, we do live in a time and in a place where there is a noticeable homeless population. And because of the way the river works and because of its location, you will encounter homeless people on the river. Um, use common sense and courtesy. In all of my interactions with homeless people, and I now, if it's safe, kind of go out of my way to talk to them and interact with them, they are normal, nice, good human beings that are just in a tough situation. And quite frankly, if you're pleasant and you're courteous and you're nice and you use common sense, you are never going to have a negative interaction. The picture of this fish I'm holding right here was taken by a really nice homeless gentleman. I've asked lots of them to take pictures for me. I've had great conversations with them. Um, they've come down and talked to me while I'm fishing and asked questions. They're in almost all cases good people in a very crummy situation. And if you approach it like that, and if you're courteous and use common sense, you'll never ever have an issue. The other unfortunate reality is our city, like many other cities, is in the midst of an opioid epidemic. There is the potential for there to be hypodermic needles in and around the river, just like there is in any other urban area. Pay attention to where you're stepping. If you see orange, stay away. Uh, just be aware of your surroundings. I don't know anyone. I've never heard of anyone. I've never personally had a negative encounter where I've had a hypodermic needle even come close to me. But just be really, really careful and pay attention to what you're doing. Um, the real danger on the river is you being clumsy. I'm a really clumsy human being, and years of human waste and manipulation and scrap metal and shopping carts and glass and old cans. If I'm not paying attention to what I'm doing and I fall, there's lots of stuff that can cut you or scrape you or break something. I have had to get a couple tetanus shots because I've fallen on rebar and metal things like that. So pay attention to what you're doing. Use common sense. Riprap is really hard to walk on, and most of the river is riprap. So pay attention to what you're stepping on and double check your step before you make it. The last thing to consider is hazardous river crossings. There are places where there's portages for boats. There are places that are noted on signs that you need to watch out for a deep spot or a deep pocket or a very deep channel. Pay attention when you're crossing the river to where you're stepping. You don't want to fall into a bucket or get stuck and have a drowning issue. Again, it's pretty low risk, but just pay attention to what you're doing. We did talk about the high bacteria levels earlier. Um, quite frankly, if there's an E. coli posting where you're accessing the river, don't wade in it. That'll usually pass pretty quickly. There have been industrial spills into the river. The most famous was the benzene leak at Suncor into Sand Creek about 6 or 7 years ago. A fellow carp angler, Trevor Tanner, fly carping, who's kind of a carp legend, actually found that benzene leak and reported it to the EPA. And because he acted quickly, the EPA was able to mitigate damage and make sure that Suncor did everything that they had to do to clean it up. And that spot still fishes great. So if you see a chemical leak, if you smell something weird, if you see dead fish, please call the Denver EPA office immediately. If you reach out to Denver Trout Unlimited, we have spill or kill cards that we can give you so you have a quick access. Or if you want to add this number, 303-312-6312 to your phone, If you see anything weird, report it. The quicker we get it fixed, the less impact it has to our fishery. Quite frankly, common sense is always your best course of action. If you're courteous and use common sense, you'll always be safe. You'll have fun fishing, and there'll never be an issue. So we'll go to the last slide. That's just my contact information. Yvonne will share this presentation both on our blog and I think in the comments of YouTube shortly thereafter. Reach out to me. We're going to be working from home for the next couple weeks. We're going to have our live chat options open. I'm going to have my email open. If I'm not at the shop, they can transfer you to me, call me, send me emails, ask me questions. I really like talking about this stuff, and it's really nice to have like kind of the normalcy of talking about fishing in this crazy time. So keep me busy. I love talking about it. If you have further questions and want to get deeper into it, there's a bunch of great reads out there. Carp on the Fly by Barry Reynolds is out of print right now, but there are some used copies on Amazon. It is the Bible on how to catch carp on the fly. I learned everything I know from Barry in that book. I highly recommend you picking it up. Pat Dorsey's Fly Fisher's Guide to the South Platte has my little kind of boring part about the Denver South Platte in it, and then a bunch of other awesome information about Deckers and Cheeseman and the lakes in South Park and all kinds of really cool fishing opportunities. It's amazing to think that you can, as an angler, go up to the headwaters of the South Platte, up above Fairplay, and catch fish in it all the way out to the state line where it meets Nebraska. You could, in potentially a week, go and fish every major stretch of that South Platte River and catch fish in it. I mean, that's a cool resource that we have here in Colorado. Get out there and explore not only the Denver stretch, but all the other stretches that don't get talked about or don't get seen. That book is the definitive guide to it, and you can go see cool places you've never seen before and catch fish all throughout the state. So adventure is the coolest part about fly fishing. Trying new things and figuring out new fisheries is kind of what keeps me going. And while I've spent a lot of time on this river out of necessity, just I don't have a ton of time to fish, I'm still finding new things out about it every single week. So get out there and explore, have fun, ask questions, really take your time and enjoy the time you get to spend on the water, and let us know how we at Trouts can help you. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks again to Yvonne for putting these series together and manning the control booth remotely. And really can't wait to see you guys in the new shop and see you all on the water when everything's back to normal. Look forward to seeing lots of happy, fun fishing faces on the Denver South Platte in the weeks to come. Thanks again. Have a great rest of your day.